This presentation is about Roman culture, and the dates I have set here are kind of tentative because it's not exactly clear when Rome began. There's different myths about the founding of Rome, and so the dates that scholars toss around are 753 BCE or 625 BCE. We do know that Rome began many, many years before the Christian era, and the date that most people place at the end of the Roman culture is 476 CE, when Rome was sacked and Rome basically disappeared. So why do we talk about Rome? Why is Rome important? There are a lot of lines in English about all roads lead to Rome, when in Rome do as the Romans do. I mean, that Rome is still part of our Western consciousness. One of the reasons why Rome is important is because it established the primacy of Western Europe. The Roman Empire, as you can see from the map in your textbook, was enormous, and actually it was even bigger than the map shows because it went up into Britain, went into Eastern Europe, so it made Western Europe the driving force of the world. It was a huge empire, and so it had a tremendous influence over the development of the world. And it absorbed and assimilated many diverse cultures. And one of the things that made the Roman Empire successful was that it found the right balance between turning other cultures into Rome and letting Rome become different because of the cultures that it took in. So, for example, when Gaul was captured, when what's modern-day France was captured into the Roman Empire, the people were allowed to keep their gods, their traditions, their language, and so it was a more smooth transition into the empire. They created practical tools that we still use: calendar, Roman alphabet, Roman roads, Roman aqueducts that are still in existence, still being used to bring water, and so we daily take advantage of the things that the Romans created. They became an important example for later civilizations, including our own, of how to manage a large country, how to deal with diverse groups within a single country, the costs of expansion, and the difficulty of finding good leadership. So Horace, a Roman writer, in talking about the relationship between Greece and Rome, said that captive Greece took her captor captive. I know it's a little complex, but saying, of course, that Rome, even though Rome was the captor, even though Rome took over Greece, Greece captivated Rome by its influence. Greek culture was a heavy, heavy influence on Rome. So how was Rome influenced by Greece? Greek art forms you see throughout the Roman world: vases, marble and bronze sculpture, architecture. The ideal of democracy survived in Rome for a long time. The first 700 or so years of Roman history was Republican Rome, which died hard under the empire, but was an ideal and was really fought for by a lot of Romans. Greek literary forms and philosophies took root and developed in Rome. But Rome was different from Greece in a lot of important ways. First of all, the art in Rome was more realistic and practical, that most of the art we see has purposes that are different from those in Greece, often political purposes. The philosophy in Rome stressed behavior, not metaphysics, and part of this had to do with the fact that the Romans were capturing such diverse cultures that they didn't try to institute controls over what people thought or what people believed, but they did try to control how they behaved. And so there was a lot of freedom of thought, but the behavior was quite strictly controlled, especially in the empire. The Romans were creative problem solvers. They used these influences to meet their own needs, and they had a much greater sense of their historical position. Although Greece had a tremendous influence on the world, the Romans were more aware of the influence that they were trying to have on the future. So when the Romans first came into Italy, there was already culture there, the Etruscans. And you can see from this Apollo of Veii sculpture that the Etruscans were influenced by archaic Greece. This is much like a Koros statue with the archaic smile, with the stiff body, stylized clothes, stylized hair. The Etruscans supposedly conquered Rome in 7th century BC, but they eventually were assimilated into Rome. And you can see that the myths of founding, like Virgil's Aeneid, Romulus and Remus, really don't give a lot of credence to the Etruscan culture, but more and more scholars are recognizing that Etruscans are a huge influence on Rome. The Etruscan alphabet and numerals eventually became Roman, and like I said, there's a lot of argument about how important the Etruscans were. More and more scholars are recognizing that the Etruscans played a huge role in the development of Rome. So one example of Roman art is the Roman Forum, and part of the reason I wanted you to look at this closely is because it has a lot of similarities to the Acropolis in Athens. It creates a sort of city center where all the main government and economic buildings are together, where people can meet, talk about ideas, where different agencies can interact with each other, sort of like what we've tried to set up in America in Washington, D.C., where things are close, where people can interact with each other. The Roman Forum housed the high priest, the Senate, temples, and public meeting places. And so it was a mixture of religion, of government, and of society. It was both a marketplace and a seat of government. And so I have the question of, is this a good mixture? And whether or not it is now, it was considered to be back then that economics and government and trade were all tied together. And the Roman Forum was built up and built up and built up under new emperors. And if you get online, you can see some digital recreations of the Roman Forum, what it might have looked like in its heyday. Obviously now there's not much standing from it, but enough that you can get a sense of how big it was and how vibrant it was, I think. Now, Republican Rome, up until the beginning of the empire, so about 31 BCE, the Republic was democratic, was elected leadership, and one of the major art forms of the Republic was portraiture. And so you have this portrait in your text of Cicero, who was a real champion of the Republic. And from looking at this, I think you can get a good sense of what Republican art was like. It was focused on realism, an attempt to express both the outer appearance and the inner character of the sitter. So from looking at Cicero, you get a sense of his dignity, you get a sense of what he probably looked like, but it's a very sympathetic portrayal of him. It tended to be quite propagandistic, making important people look good and not so important people not look so good. But you get a sense here of the Roman ideal, that age and wisdom are gained through hard experience, that unlike the Alexander the Great sculpture from Hellenistic Greece, this bust of Cicero presents the wisdom of his age. You see the lines around his eyes and around his mouth. You see his receding hairline, a sense that this is where we should be looking for leadership. And in this is the ideal of pietas, from which our English word piety comes, but it's not a religious ideal so much as a political one, that you sacrifice yourself for the country, that your duty to Rome comes before any personal desires that you might have. And this becomes central to the Roman philosophy about how life should be lived. So in Roman philosophy, we have two main schools, and these were borrowed from Greece but adapted. One of them is Epicureanism, and you get Epicureans believe that you should next.
And you can see this in the writings of Roman writers, for example, Horace, who says, let's drink now, right? In Book 1, number 10, it says, "My dear Maecenas, noble knight, you'll drink cheap Sabian here tonight from common cups," that we have to live our lives now while we can because we don't know what's coming. They didn't believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in political engagement. They should be free to live. And on the other extreme is Stoicism. And the best example of this is Marcus Aurelius, who you also have, whose meditations you have in the reading. And Stoicism was about doing all you can and leaving the rest up to God or the gods. Focus on what you can control. Sacrifice your own interests for the common good, and that the goal is self-control. And so you have these two main schools of thought constantly in play throughout Rome. It's kind of the Apollonian and the Dionysian that we talked about a bit in Greece. The pull toward duty or the pull toward pleasure. Do you think of yourself? Do you think of your country? Do you actively engage with the country? Do you back away? And so I would love for you to think about this a little bit and think where you stand in relation to these philosophies. So in 31
CE, there was a battle, the Battle of Actium. What had happened was Julius Caesar, who was the Republican leader, though he was emperor, he was basically an emperor, although he was always elected. He was assassinated, and he had three heirs, and they fought amongst themselves until you got to the Battle of Actium, which was in 31 BCE, in which Octavian, who becomes Augustus Caesar, Julius Caesar's nephew, defeats Mark Antony and becomes Augustus Caesar. And he oversaw a vast multi-ethnic empire. He was the emperor over a huge bureaucracy and really encouraged civil service people to be involved, and he really built up the Roman army. So when Augustus took power in 31 CE, he had some big problems that he had to solve. First of all, Rome was at war. During Republican Rome, they had constantly been at war. And so now they were in the period called the Pax Romana, where you had lots of soldiers who weren't fighting anymore, that needed to be assimilated back into society. And so he had to figure out what to do with Rome in peacetime. Also, the family was breaking down. There was high rates of adultery and divorce and low birth rate. And so he needed people to get married and have children. So he instituted some pretty strict laws that people had to get married and have children so that the empire could be built up. There was poor infrastructure. The water wasn't getting to the city. The buildings weren't effective, and so he instituted a huge building project to turn a city of brick into a city of marble. There was a high crime rate, and so he created a strong police force, pulled on a lot of those soldiers to be part of the police force and fire department. Hopefully you can see a lot of parallels to modern society with the problems we have to deal with. One of the works that represents Augustus Caesar's tenure is the Ara Pacis, which was built in 9 BCE. And this is an altar to peace, specifically to the peace that Augustus inaugurated. And you get a picture of it here, and I have a close-up here of the statues of the family on the sides. And what this does is it, first of all, blurs the distinction between architecture and sculpture. Is this a work of sculpture? Is this a building? It's an altar, but the sculpture around the outside is really central to it, much in the same way that the Parthenon in Greece made use of sculpture and had many arts all together in one. Around the sides of this altar throughout the altar there are carvings of Augustus and of the Aeneid, and so he connects himself, his current leadership to this past of Rome, of this founding, this duty-based founding of Rome at the behest of the gods. And the statues of the family on the sides represent, first of all, Augustus's place as the protector of the family, the builder-up of the Roman family, but it also shows the importance of family ties and of these connections, his connection to Caesar, this bloodline, which becomes central to the empire. It's a beautiful work of art. You can see it's borrowing from classical Greece with the calm faces, with the very ordered, organized picture. And you have some other images from the Ara Pacis in your text. Now, another quintessential example of Roman art is an arch. And there were arches built throughout the Roman Empire, generally to commemorate victories, military victories. Obviously, Rome was built through its military, through conquest, and so these arches are a visual reminder of that, and they will often be placed over major thoroughfares. And the example you have in your text is the Arch of Titus from 81 of the Christian era, and it was built after Titus was already dead, after he had become a god in the mindset of Rome. Whether or not people really believed that is another question. So the Arch of Titus is an example of a really common Roman military form, and that's the arch, which were built all over the Roman Empire, not just in Italy, but throughout France, England, Spain, down into Africa, that they built these arches to remind people very visually of the importance of the military and of military conquest, and also of the strength of the government. This that you have in your text, the Arch of Titus, was built in 81 CE, and it commemorates the Roman capture of Jerusalem. And you can see on the side, on this small close-up, the Romans carrying the menorah out of the temple that they've destroyed the temple and they've plundered the riches. And so it reminds me a lot of the monuments that we have in America to wars, to military victories, because it's also a record of loss of the people who died there. But it shows how important military is to the country, how important this ideal of fighting for your country is to the Roman Empire. And the Roman arch is central to architecture. In Greece, we saw a lot more post and lintel architecture, and the arch becomes the driving force of Roman architecture. You can see this in the Colosseum. You see this in the Pantheon when an arch is turned to make a dome. And so a major difference between Greek and Roman architecture is this use of the arch. All right, so the most important piece of Roman literature, from my perspective and a lot of other people's, is Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid is an epic poem that tells the story of the founding of Rome at the hands of Aeneas, who is a Trojan who escapes from the aftermath of the Trojan War. It's similar to Homer's poetry in a lot of ways, and this was on purpose. Virgil wanted to establish Rome culturally, and so he did it by looking to the greatest example of Greek literature, which are Homer's poems. So a lot of similarities. It's based around heroes. It involves warfare. It's a long, epic narrative poem divided into books. He uses similes to describe what happens in the war and to connect those to people's lives. It involves lots of different people from different countries, and there's some sympathy for the conquered, which we see in the Iliad as well. But there's some major differences. This is a literary epic. It's meant to be read, even though it was often read out loud, and Virgil read pieces of it out loud to Augustus as he was writing it. But it's much more crafted as a literary work. And unlike the Iliad, which looks at the rage of Achilles, Virgil's Aeneid has a political message, which is the costs of duty. And you can see this, for example, in Book 4, where Aeneas is forced to leave Dido behind. Even though he loves her, even though they were building a life together in Carthage, he has to leave her because he has a duty from the gods to go and found Rome, and that there's no place for his personal pleasure and personal happiness in that. And so it's kind of a stark vision of what it means to be a Roman, that you have to put your country before yourself, but it's and important to the Roman mindset. And Virgil's writing to a specifically Roman audience. And some of the most famous lines from this poem are in Book 6, lines 96 to 100, where Virgil talks about the arts of Rome, what it is to be Roman. And the lines say this: "Yet others fashion from bronze more lifelike breathing images, for so they shall, and evoke living faces from marble. Others excel as orators, others track with their instruments the planets circling in heaven, and predict when stars will appear. But Romans, never forget that government is your medium. Be this your art, to practice men in the habit of peace, generosity to the conquered, and firmness against aggressors." So the arts of Rome are not those of Greece. They're not going to be the greatest ones in creating bronze images and science and all that kind of thing that the Greeks were famous for. But their art is government. Their art is rulership. Their art is generosity to the conquered and firmness against aggressors. So this text is important for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a great read. Really, really interesting story. It has a huge influence on later literature. I mean, references to the Aeneid come up all over the place. But it also establishes the classical foundations for Rome, that Rome is based in Greece, builds on Greece, and that the gods have ordained the building of Rome. It provides a model for Roman behavior. Aeneas is who you're supposed to be like. You're supposed to put the country first. And it establishes Rome with a culture of its own. suggesting that under Augustus, that Rome has finally achieved the status where it can have its own epic. So the Roman arts are based on Greek and Etruscan models, but they're adapted to Roman purposes, and those are specifically usually political purposes, especially to support the leaders, support the empire, help shape people into the kind of citizens that the Roman Empire needs. And the Roman arts are spread through a huge geographical area. They carried civilization in the Roman sense to the farthest reaches of empire, and an essential way to do that was through the visual arts, through literature, through philosophy. It's a way of creating a unified country.